I was teaching, 3 different, part-time teaching jobs, adjunct, and teaching a creative writing course for the library. And I was teaching in a low-res program in New Hampshire, poetry. And the adjunct job was at a Jesuit school here in Cleveland called John Carroll, and I was teaching a class in memoir. And I thought, it's winter in Cleveland. I want to be someplace else. And didn't Ernest Hemingway, write a memoir set in Paris in the 1920s? And that just sounded like a great escape. And I didn't really know. And Hemingway was not ever, I wasn't ever a big fan. He wasn't one of my people. I'm too muscular and too, misogynistic. And just his sentences. I like beautiful, I'm Fitzgerald, right? Why would I? Hemingway was just too stripped back. But that book, A Movable Feast, which I picked up, just did that thing. It completely drew me in like a magic carpet, right, to that world. And I just had this profound reaction to the book, reading it and my hands shaking, and so deeply invested in these characters. So Hadley Richardson was Hemingway's first wife of 4. He met her at a party in Chicago in 1920, and they moved to Paris when he was 21 and she was 29. So she was a slightly older woman, kind of this Victorian holdout, not modern at all. And they, moved to Paris, and that's where he found his genius. Got guidance from Ezra Pound and Gertrude Stein and Ford Madox Ford, and essentially all these people being geniuses together and inventing modernism, and, meeting F. Scott Fitzgerald at the Dingo Bar, that kind of stuff. That world was just so dreamy and delicious, and not Cleveland, where I had a baby and a toddler and a surly 12-year-old. And I just had all these questions. Hemingway is really good at, he's not very nice in that book. He turns this laser-like acuity and attention on the foibles of others. And he never turns that back on himself. And he's not very revealing about his own life and really what's happening. And over the course of that book, we see him young and married and in love. And then we see another woman enter the scene, but it's all talked about Have you read that book, by the way, Jake, A Movable Feast? It's very tangential, He's not ever overt about what happens in his personal life. But at the end of that book, he says something like, I wished I had died. He says this of Hadley. I wished I had died before I ever loved anyone but her. And this is when we realize that his marriage is falling apart. And at the end of the book, it's like we were young and poor and in love, and we'll always have Paris or something like that, right? But I had all these questions that the book didn't answer. And so I took myself to the Cleveland Public Library and found some biographies. And, that's when I really found Hadley's voice and point of view, and understood that I had found a really interesting access point to that world, because she's an outsider, right? She's not an artist. It was just crazy. It was bonkers. Again, it was like drinking out of a fire hose. As soon as I had this idea, and I, went and Googled and made sure that book hadn't been written. And I told my agent, Julie, that I'd had this idea. And I'm like, forget anything I might have told you about what I'm writing. I'm, writing a novel about Ernest Hemingway's first wife and their sex and absinthe and bullfighting and a menage a trois in the French Riviera. And she said, my God, yes, you're going to write that book. Write it as fast as you can. And I knew that it was a big idea. I mean, I just felt like I had been struck by lightning. And my husband at the time was a composer working all the time. And I was always working these part-time teaching jobs. And I And when I was working on writing A Ticket to Ride, the drafting of that took me 5 years because I had these kids and no time, sometimes only an hour a day to work on that book. So I sat him down and I said, listen, I think I've had the biggest idea of my creative life and I'm going to die if I, have to take 5 years to write this novel. And he did this remarkable thing. He borrowed money from his mother so that I could quit the teaching that I had been doing, which hadn't been paying very much. I mean, 3 jobs, I still was probably making $25,000 a year. Yeah. I had over 100 students, right? It's a hard way to make a living. And it just takes all that time. And so I wrote every single day at a Starbucks in Cleveland near my house. And I was very proletarian about it, schlepped in all my research materials. I sat at the same table every day. I had, I always say for $1.80, which is what it costs for a tall dark roast coffee. That was my office. And I wrote that book in 7 months. And I think the force of that, I couldn't go to Paris, I had to read my way there. And the experience that I had when I was a kid, wrapping the world of a book around myself, like that was my safe harbor, like that was my cocoon. That experience of walking into a Starbucks, sitting down, and 6 hours would pass when I was inside that world. And because I was learning so much, it's like, oh my God, I have to read all of Hemingway now. And I have to read biographies of Stein and Fitzgerald. And I have to read all of Fitzgerald. And I have to read everything I can possibly find on Paris in the 1920s and what modernism is, and sort of everything about World War I and sort of what they had just survived. And then I went to Boston. I found a cache of Ernest and Hadley's love letters and kind of steeped myself in their language. I had no permission to use their actual language. There is not a single word in The Paris Wife that I didn't invent. But having that as like at the pool I was swimming in, their language helped me take that into my body. I do think that I'm a pretty good mimic. It's probably an aspect of the way I grew up, hearing other people's voices. And it's quite easy for me to disappear into the role of a character. And Hadley was that for me. It's a reason that I write in the first person.
Along with her, how much fun was it to inhabit these other characters of that era and get to do their dialogue and get to be them in that moment?
It was ridiculous. It was a ridiculous amount of fun. I mean, more fun than should be legal to have as a writer. My God, it was absolutely amazing. And this is what I like about novels too. It just takes everything you are and more, and, everything you notice and every thought you've ever had and all the things you care about and your subconscious and what's cooking back there in the dark. And it just takes all of that and then transmutes it, transforms it. It's creative alchemy. And I didn't know that history was this, a key. It's like Emily Dickinson saying, write the truth, but write it slant. So having this historical scrim, right? That being the world, and then taking all the things from me and merging them with a character is a sweet spot for me to be more revealing, more intimate. And it's continuing education. I love all the stuff I get to learn in my research. It's phenomenal. I think it's what keeps me interested too. I knew it was special to me. I knew it had already changed my life. I had never given myself over so completely to a book before. I knew it was the best thing I had ever done. I had never had moments where I'll still pick up pages, and not just The Paris Wife. Since then, it was definitely a threshold piece. And I'll read pages and I'm like, I wrote that? I don't remember writing that. It just sort of like came through me. And that level of what we call a flow state, I'd never had that deep of a flow state where I wasn't really crafting so much as I was just getting the hell out of the way. So this stuff could kind of move through me. Yeah. And then when, we submitted the book, it was really hilarious because I had had that process before be excruciating, right? Just waiting to hear. It's hard. It's like hard to stay in your skin knowing that people are reading your work and having thoughts and opinions, and you're probably going to send you a rejection letter, et cetera. So I had planned a trip to Florida to go to Hemingway's house in Key West. As a treat for myself. And it's kind of silly now when I think about it. I had zero money. So I flew to Orlando because that's what I could afford from Cleveland to Orlando. It's still like 8 or 9 hours driving to get down to Key West. But anyway, I booked this trip and Julie calls me and she says, "Are you ready to talk to editors next week?" I literally had just pushed send. I said, "What are you talking about?" She's like, "I'm lining up calls. You have to talk to these editors who are reading your work." I said, "I'm going to Florida." She's like, "No, no, 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 no. You're doing this thing." And I said, "I'll find a way." So I flew to Orlando and I rented a car and I drove to Key West, and literally like every hour or two, I pulled over to these rest stops and I talked to these editors who literally had read my book over the weekend and were saying the most incredible things about the impact the book had on them emotionally and the promise they saw in it. And I remember talking to Julie in between two of these calls, and she said, "Are you having fun?" I said, "My God, yes." She's like, "Okay, enjoy it. It may never happen again. We never know. So be in, like, really feel it. Take this in. It should feel amazing. Your work is amazing. Be happy." So I've never forgotten that. It's really good advice. Surf's up, right? When the wave is big, ride it.